St. Augustine wrote, "Death is nothing. I have just passed into another room. Dry your tears if you love me." The problem is grief can't be cured by words. And in this modern world, the need to pay the bills forces so many grieving people to go back to work within a matter of days. Is there room for grief at the office? Well, first we'll tell you about two hardworking but heartbroken employees who discovered that the answer for them was no.
At that point, my whole world ended.
It was 7 years ago, but Rachel Kodanaz still can't forget the moment doctors told her that Rod had died from a massive heart attack in his office parking lot. He was 32.
And I just said, that's easy. It's not my husband. He ran 8 miles at lunch today.
But it was her husband. And Rachel, who had rarely missed a day of work in her 5 years as a manager for the Sprint phone company, needed a month off to cope. When she returned, to her shock, many co-workers ignored her, at a loss for what to say.
I'd get into a staff meeting, and I'd hear people whisper, "Don't tell Rachel that, she's going to get upset."
Something else happened. She says her boss downgraded her nearly perfect performance record to average because of the time off.
I looked down at that evaluation and I said, this is the most devastating thing that's happened to me since his death.
As a single parent, Rachel needed to work, and she had to be transferred to a less demanding job. She says her boss refused to help, saying, "You'll ruin your career."
I was stuck. I was stuck at Sprint. I was stuck in my current life. I was stuck at my house. I was stuck being a widow. I was just stuck.
Every year, more than 4 million Americans are trapped between the need to grieve and the need to work. Most companies stick to the standard 3-day leave policy. Beyond that, it's up to an employee supervisor.
And in 3 days, you cannot even get a tear out. You can't get to a funeral. You cannot memorialize. You can't do anything in 3 days because it takes 48 hours to get over the shock.
Even for the head of a company, carrying the burden of personal tragedy can be overwhelming.
That was a beautiful day.
Paul Clendening and his wife Nancy lost their 16-year-old son Brandon to leukemia 8 years ago. And still, they grieve.
I think of his sense of humor and his all-out soccer play.
And he was brave, and I always remember that. Sweetness and bravery.
At first, Paul threw himself into his work with excellent results. But soon after the anniversary of his son's death, he had flashbacks and broke down.
My hands would sweat, my stomach would get nervous. My knees would start to shake. Sitting there at the desk, having the same conversation with somebody. There I am a year into this process, and they people assume you're okay after 6 weeks.
As work pressure mounted, Paul repeatedly called his board of directors for help.
They didn't respond, and they really never gave me any sense of comfort zone or support.
Finally, Paul quit. Today, he's president of a different bank. As for Rachel, she started her own business, counseling companies on how to cope with grief.
Why can't we grieve when we go to our soccer games? Why can't we grieve when we go to our business meetings? Why can't we be us? We're supposed to cover our mirrors. We're supposed to, go to a wake. We're supposed to do our grieving at home, but in today's society, we don't do that. We go back to the workforce.
Joining us now with some advice about all this, Naomi Neyerman, president of the American Hospice Foundation, who also advises people and corporations. Glad to have you here. 3 days bereavement leave, is it enough, and how much would be?
3 days is barely enough to get to the funeral, to travel halfway across country, as some of us must, to see our family. It's barely enough to attend to the family traditions, cultural, religious traditions. It's barely enough to do the business, the logistics, not to start even with the grief that follows.
But how long can a company afford to give? We saw in the case of Paul Clendening that really it was a year of intense grief for him. Can a company afford to do that?
Well, in Paul's case, he actually deferred his grief until later, and that upon the anniversary of his child's death is when he really began to grieve. So I think the point we want to remember is if we attend to it earlier, then the length is probably curtailed. The sooner we work at it, the less it takes to get over it, it seems to me.
Let's talk about attending to it. First, what can managers and companies do?
Well, I think you have to be there. You have to go to the funeral, send cards with thoughtful notes, be comforting in a way that that is comfortable for you. But then be flexible and be patient.
On the job performance, you mean?
Yes, so that what you're doing is demonstrating that the employee is a valued employee, that with flexibility, you can work towards returning to the workplace in a way that is productive as in previous productivity levels.
If the employee's still having trouble after months, what then?
I think to the extent that it's possible, depending on the size of the organization and the job situation, job sharing, part-time for a while, any kind of accommodations that can be made to keep the person intact and productive.
Tell me the three most important things co-workers can do, humans relating to each other.
Be very open and honest with your own feelings, but keep your own issues intact. Listen. Be there in terms of sharing your memories that may be inspiring to the person. But most hopefully, I think, will be to help out in the job situation as well as outside the job.
Naomi Nyerman, our thanks to you.